My task is to think about justification in recent debates. The truth is, it's been a controversial doctrine right from the beginning, of course. So Paul was accused of all sorts of things, which you can see reflected in some of his letters. For example, he was accused of preaching a message, justification, which would lead to license, to more sin. And he combats that accusation in Romans 3 early on, and then in Romans 6 as well. And then, of course, the Reformation debates about justification with the Roman Catholic Church, and then in Vatican II as well. You'll find the issue of justification was a contested one right through these last 500 years. And there have been in recent years some attempts to bring Protestant churches together with Roman Catholic scholars to think about justification afresh. I'm not up with those debates. So you can talk to Reese or someone else about them. The gist of what I want to talk about, as you can see from the handout, is the new perspective on Paul. And I hope there'll be something for everyone, because I imagine there's quite a range of exposure to the new perspective in the room. Some people will have heard it referred to, don't know much more than that. Others will have read refutations of the new perspective. Some of you will have read new perspective scholars firsthand. And my goal is to help us, first of all, to understand what the new perspective affirms, and the issues at stake. The main goal is to get out of here alive. The gist of the new perspective is that the Judaism of Paul's day was not a religion of legalism, but of grace. And you can tell from what Reese has told us that the doctrine of justification by faith is situated over against Paul's Jewish opponents in the first century. So in one sense, the new perspective on Paul is really a new perspective on Judaism. Scholars went back to the first century and earlier Jewish sources, particularly the Jewish sources that are not in the Old Testament or the New Testament, the so-called intertestamental Jewish sources, the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on at Qumran. And they said, look, these Jews are not legalistic. They like the law, but they think they're saved by grace. And that became a great challenge to a Protestant reading of Paul, if you like. Paul's doctrine of justification is a biblical one. It's right there, of course. But the new perspective says that it's not about how sinners can find a gracious God. It's about the terms on which Gentiles can be admitted to the people of God. So for most new perspective scholars, the doctrine of justification is not about soteriology, about how you get saved. It's about ecclesiology, the church. It's not so much a vertical doctrine as a horizontal doctrine. It's not about my standing before God. It's how, as a Gentile, and I mean you filthy Gentiles, how you can be included in the people of God. So that's really just to set us up, and we'll see how we go. So I've got a little handout for you. Everyone got the handout? Yes? So under point 1, I'd like to talk briefly about some of the main players, if you like, a little bit of a history of the interpretation. And my main point here is that it's a pretty complex field, and there really isn't a new perspective anymore. There are new perspectives, and as scholars go, you'd expect this, I suppose, and none of them agree with each other on very much. The main 3 associated with the beginnings of the movement were E.P. Sanders, James Dunn, and N.T. Wright. So E.P. Sanders wrote a book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism, back, I think it was 1977. And it basically went through the intertestamental Jewish sources that I just talked about, and it claims that Jews in Paul's day were not legalistic. They thought they were saved by grace, God's mercy and grace. That's how you get in to the covenant. You stay in by keeping the law. So they made a distinction, Jews did, between getting in and staying in. That's Sanders' language. And he claimed that the religion of many of the Jews of the first century was what you might call covenantal nomism. And a lot of this isn't that important, but it'll help you to kind of get a feel for the field. James Dunn came along and through a number of publications, some essays, also a 2-volume commentary on Romans and a commentary on Galatians. And his contribution had in particular to do with the phrase works of law, which I'll deal with in a moment. But basically you'll remember that phrase from several texts in Galatians and Romans, where Paul says, we are not justified by works of law. Yep, most Protestants to that point had taken that to mean by keeping the law. James Dunn said, no, it doesn't mean the law in general. It has a very specific referent in mind, namely the identity markers of being a Jew. Circumcision, Sabbath, food laws in particular. So when we read in Paul's letters, we are not justified by works of the law. Most of us would think we're not justified by doing the law. What Paul meant was we're not justified by becoming Jews. We're not justified by becoming part of Israel. We can be Gentile believers as part of the people of God, separate to those requirements of the law that separated Jews from Gentiles. I'll come back to that as well. And then N.T. Wright came along in his wake, in the wake of, if you think of a summer analogy, you've got a big wave building and N.T. Wright's just about to drop in. He wrote a book initially called, it was quite modestly titled, What St. Paul Really Said. And it's not a long book, and basically deals with the justification, righteousness language about which we're speaking. And he's pretty much with Dunn and Sanders, that Paul's target is not Jewish legalism, but Jewish ethnocentrism, Jewish imperialism, Jewish privilege, those kind of things. Yep. So one of his contributions was to say that the righteousness language in Paul's hands means covenantal faithfulness. We're saved by God's covenantal faithfulness. And then one of the things about Tom Wright is his extraordinary output, of course. So he's written many books, and only a few of them really are on this area, which I'll come back to actually. I'm coming back to quite a few things. That's my way of getting out of here, so I'll just say, I'll come back to that later. And the main one recently is Paul and the faithfulness of God. Just this massive thing. And I still haven't got through it, so I might tell you something. Now, there was, of course, so in a sense, the new perspective was a protest movement. It was an attempt at correcting something, our understanding of Paul and justification and the Jewish context into which he wrote. So you had some scholars wanting to push back. Most of the pushback was quite piecemeal. What we needed was someone to go through all the Jewish sources again and to see whether Sanders was right. And that took a long time. We finally got there with a couple of volumes edited by Carson, Seifrid and Peter O'Brien called, this is a title that won't sell, Justification and Variegated Nomism. But the title tells the story. So what they said was the picture that Sanders painted of a monolithic covenantal nomism, you get in through the covenant by grace, you stay in by keeping the law, is not accurate. It's a variegated picture that you get, which is that really a word? I'm not even sure. Sam thinks it is, okay. So yeah, that's the picture. So a lot of the pushback against Sanders took a long time to really get traction, because all Sanders and his supporters had to say was, you just haven't read the Targums and the Aramaic. You haven't done your homework. How would you know? So it was a big task. One of the reasons Sanders got such attention is that his book was not just controversial, it was formidable. It was a big task he took on. And to respond meant you couldn't just write an essay, even though people did. So some of the big responses of the next two names are two of the people who pushed back, and the next two names are people who kind of pushed through the middle. So the next two names, Stephen Westerholm is a supporter of the Lutheran understanding. He had one book called Israel's Law and the Church's Faith. And he wrote another I think it was a revision of that book, much bigger, called Perspectives Old and New, The Lutheran Paul and His Critics. Yep, so you get the picture. He basically said Luther was actually right. When you look closely at Paul's letters, there is a contrast between believing and doing. It's not just doing certain identity markers of Judaism, it's a broader reference. That's really summarising a lot of work very simply, but that's basically what he said. Now, Simon Gathercole, another evangelical, pushed back with his doctoral thesis. He looked at boasting. So I'll deal with these in a moment, but just think with me, what difference would it make in the Reformed understanding, Lutheran understanding of boasting in Paul's letters, and the the New Perspective understanding? Yep. So boasting for Luther was being able to say that I've attained my right standing with God by my own works. Yep. The New Perspective scholars came along and said that's not what boasting is about. Boasting is about Jewish ethnocentrism. It's about saying those filthy Gentiles are outside of the covenant. We're the circumcised. We're the true Israel. We're God's people. We have the covenants, etc. So there was a very big difference in the boasting, in the understanding of boasting itself in Paul's letters. And Gathercole did a very fine study of the theme and really showed that the New Perspective, in his view, was mistaken. There is a more fundamental contrast in Paul's thought, as I said, between believing and doing. And that's why grace is needed. So that's a little intro. Oh, no, sorry, Francis Watson, John Barclay. So Francis Watson wrote a book called Paul, Judaism and the Gentiles. And he was, initially, I think it was right 1986, he was pretty much on the train of the New Perspective. In fact, he was stoking the engine at the front. It's a steam train. And basically everything was reduced, and this is not caricature, this is the way it was presented, to sociology. The New Testament in Paul's letters are really about the issue behind justification is table fellowship. How are Jews and Gentiles going to eat together? And Paul's answer is, we're all justified not by keeping the Sabbath, by the food laws, and by circumcision. We're not justified by works of the law. Yep, with me? So the interesting thing about Francis Watson, he wrote that in 1986. 2007, he revised the book and said, actually, it doesn't work. There's more theology we need to bring into this. And he became a student of the Old Testament in ways that changed his view. I think he actually became a more firm believer, or however he would describe that. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but his new version in 2007 was much more theological, if you like, than sociological in its explanation. Okay, New interpretation. So what I've done is I've listed on the first page under number 2 several phrases or themes in Paul's letters that take on a different hue when read in the light of the new perspective. And basically, I'd like to go through them. Some of them I'll say more about than others. And then on the second side, don't turn over yet, we'll try and give an assessment of the new perspective. So the works of the law one I've already mentioned, but just to come back to it, and just to show you the kind of thing that the New Perspective scholars point to in Paul's letters when they assert their interpretation. And just remember, these people are not dumb. These are very fine scholars and rigorous in every sense. So, for example, if you look at Romans 3:28, so if you've got a Bible, that would help. Romans 3:28 says, "For we conclude that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law." Okay, it sounds like a good Lutheran verse. Read the next verse. "Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles, since there is one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith." So it's interesting, isn't it? They pointed out that very often in these contexts, the issue does seem to be the inclusion of the Gentiles in the people of God. So that's works of the law. I'll stop saying I'll come back to it, but I promise I will. So it also turns up in Galatians, Romans 3:20. I might even look at this quickly now. So Romans 3:20 is another occurrence of that phrase. Have a look. "No one will be justified in his sight by the works of the law." Is he only talking about the Jewish identity markers? In that context, it's less clear, isn't it? Because the knowledge of sin comes through the law. That seems much more general than simply the Jewish identity markers. So it may be that the referent, to use the technical language of that phrase, works of the law, in some contexts is Jewish identity markers, but more likely it's a broader reference to works done in obedience to the law. It's Paul's shorthand for works done in obedience to the law. We've mentioned boasting already, which is a great theme. You should grab your concordance and look at the word to boast. Romans 3:27, we're in Romans 3, so stay there. "Where then is boasting? It is excluded." So if we're justified by grace through faith, can we boast? So if you're justified and I'm not, maybe you could boast. Except you can't, because it's not by a law of works, on the contrary, but by a law of faith. Now, Paul is playing with the word to law there, the noun law. The law is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, but it can also mean principle, as it can in English, the law of gravity. So I think probably it means here something like that. On the contrary, by a law of faith, by the principle of faith, we're not able to boast. So I think the boasting language also has a broader referent that Paul has in mind than simply boasting that I'm part of the people, the historic people of God through the covenants. Interestingly, just while we're on boasting, if you go to chapter 5, there's a wonderful, it's wonderful the way Paul picks up the theme of boasting. Most of the translations miss this, but it's the same word. So back in 3:27, Paul says, "Where is boasting? It's excluded." And then in chapter 5, 1-11, we do get to boast. We boast, it's often translated rejoice. So where are we? I'll translate it, boast. "We boast in the hope of the glory of God. We boast in our sufferings." And then down in verse, where is it? 11, thank you. We boast in God. Anyway, it's just a little sidelight there. Now, the doctrine of justification itself takes on a different colour in the hand of New Perspective scholars, as I've already mentioned. It's less about our status before a holy and just God. It's more about our being part of the family of God. And I think most of the rest of the lecture is about that. Just one point here while we're in Romans. It's interesting the way the focus on certain chapters in Romans has shifted in the history of interpretation. So the Reformers, I think it's fair to say, were just enamoured by Romans 1 to 4, because that's where Paul teaches justification by grace through faith, that fundamental doctrine. What happened was some scholars came along and said, well, we ought to keep reading. Chapters 5 to 8 are actually the key to Romans. Because in chapters 5 to 8, Jesus doesn't die as our substitute, he dies as our representative. We die with Christ and are raised to walk in newness of life, chapter 6. And really, the whole business of justification was just Paul's battle doctrine. It was what he used to bash the Jews. He didn't really believe it. This is what they said. What he thinks about the cross is our participation in the death and resurrection of Christ. And then other scholars came along, and this is where the New Perspective really got some speed up. They looked at Romans 9 to 11, and they said, this isn't some appendix or interlude or digression. This is where Paul's heading. Paul's not interested in individual salvation. He's interested in the salvation of the nations, the people of God, not just Israel, because the Gentiles have been engrafted in to the vine. You with me? And you can guess what happened next. Then some scholars said, well, actually, you're missing the point completely. It's Romans 12 to 15 that's the most important part. Yep. My view is that 1 Corinthians is the most important part of Romans. Yes, so, but the ones who said that about Romans 12 to 15 said, look, Romans is not some doctrinal thesis. This is an occasional letter. And the occasion Paul is addressing is the conflict in the churches between the weak and the strong. Again, Jewish and Gentile stuff. Yep. So, as you can see, it's a complicated subject. Sam's shaking his head and wanting lunch. Okay. Imputation is the other one I want to mention. So, remember there are 3 possible imputations in Christian doctrine. There's the imputation of Adam's sin to the race. There's the imputation of our sin to Christ, both of which are less controversial than the third. The third one is the imputation of Christ's righteousness to believers. And it was interesting to hear Rees talk about Luther not using the language of imputation so much. So it is, my view is it is possible to understand justification without referring to imputation. Paul does it. But nonetheless, it's a question, isn't it? And this is part of the swirling controversies in scholarship and among churches and theologians has been about this doctrine of the imputation of Christ's righteousness to believers. So first of all, the Adam imputation, that's clearly in Romans 5, and it's understood different ways, but it seems pretty clear that it's through the one sin, through the sin of the one man, the many were made sinners. So like it or not, we all fell with Adam because he represented us. The good news is that if we died through a representative, we can rise through a representative, and through the one act of righteousness and the gift of righteousness, Paul says in Romans 5, then we can have life. So it's very clear in that passage, it seems to me, that you've got the first 2 imputations. Do we have the third imputation anywhere? Now, imputation is an accounting term in English, and it was in Greek too. So at least it overlapped in that semantic field. And it's about reckoning something to one account or another. Any accountants? No one's willing to admit it. But I think they still use this now. In fact, on the stock exchange, if you buy shares, you get imputation credits. Yeah, so the language is still in use. So one thing to say about this language is it's one of the metaphors that Paul uses to explain salvation. So in my understanding, justification is a forensic and legal metaphor. Judge, innocent, guilty, that kind of stuff. And redemption is a kind of slave market metaphor, being set free at a price. And imputation is kind of in this realm of accounting, ancient accounting. And another one would be reconciliation, which is sort of family relations, where we go from enmity with God to amity. So imputation, let's think briefly then about whether our Christ's righteousness is imputed to us. It'd be nice, wouldn't it, to be clothed with Christ. So not only are we forgiven, but Christ's righteousness is imputed to us so that we stand before God, not just forgiven sinners, but righteous in his sight. That's the kind of thing that Reformed theologians have teased out. So you find, do you? Do you find it? Philippians 3, 8 and 9, Paul says, I want to be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own. That's a kind of moment in this doctrine. You think to yourself, well, I didn't quite say it, but it's going pretty close. If it's not having a righteousness of my own, what sort of righteousness have I got? And notice too the language of union with Christ. Found in him, in union with him. But doesn't quite say it, let's be honest. 2 Corinthians 5 says, he who knew no sin became sin. So that's our imputation of our sin to Christ, presumably. So that we might become the righteousness of God in him. You say, there it is, it's right there. Well, not quite, because it didn't say the righteousness of Christ. It says the righteousness of God. Galatians 2:20 is another text familiar to many of you, and for sake of time, I'll keep moving. 1 Corinthians 1:30 is the other one people point to, where it says that Christ became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. There. However, if you push it, you've got to have not just imputed righteousness, but imputed wisdom, imputed sanctification, and imputed redemption. So it's tricky, isn't it? Now, just to cut to the chase, Leon Morris, Peter and my illustrious predecessor at Ridley, said that the imputation of Christ's righteousness is a corollary of the identification of the believer with Christ. It's a corollary of the identification of believers with Christ. In other words, it's a Christian doctrine. He did say this if you look in the context, but you can't find it affirmed in any one text. But what we're talking about with systematic theology is often like that. The doctrine of the Trinity, all the elements are there in the text, but they're not put together. So my understanding is that imputation's like that. All the elements are there, we need theologians to put them together. And Carson had a debate with one of the Gundries, I forget which one actually, there's two of them, and on this question of imputation. And he talked, the title of his chapter or article had the phrase, domains of discourse in it. So in his view, it's the issue is one of domains of discourse. If you ask, does the New Testament affirm the imputation of Christ's righteousness to believers? Exegetically, the answer is no. But in terms of systematic theology, when you move to that discussion, it's clearly a biblical doctrine. The kind of things I would point to that help us to bring that together would be the obedience and faithfulness of Christ. So what's the point of Christ's life? Does it have some saving effect? Calvin actually thought it was part of the atonement, I think, if I've read him correctly. So that there would be part of our salvation if that life of obedience and faithfulness were then reckoned to our account. The representative nature of Adam and Christ, which is very clear. The forensic nature of righteousness, the fact that to be justified is the opposite of being condemned. Righteousness as a gift, which we see in Romans 5, the gift of righteousness is a clear phrase there. And then finally, union with Christ, that wonderfully rich theme in Paul's hands of being united to Christ. Okay. Excuse me. And then finally, at this point of my material, think about the grace of God and the place of works. The New Perspective came along and they said, look, the grace of God, you can kind of see where this goes. It's like dominoes. If you make works of law about Jewish ethnocentrism, it makes boasting different, it makes imputation different, and now it's going to make grace different. The grace of God is not about the fact that he has accepted us with his unmerited mercy and favour. It's not about me, it's about the Gentiles. It's about the fact that God has accepted you filthy Gentiles into the people of God. So, and to be honest, there is something to that. Because I think the other way to say that is that the epitome of grace for Paul, the clearest example is what I just said. The fact that Gentiles have been brought into the people of God. So for example, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3 verse 10, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation. And the foundation is the people of God, mainly Gentile, in Corinth, being part of the community of the Messiah. And Paul uses grace, that word, to characterise himself as a preacher of this universal gospel, available to both Jews and Gentiles. So if you look up grace, you'll find very often in the context that's what we've got. But I think again, it's with many correctional movements, the pendulum's gone way too far, and you don't need to deny that grace means unmerited favour to accept that a great example of that is that the Gentiles are now part of the people of God. The place of works is also an issue, as you can guess, another one of the dominoes falling over. Whenever I try and do that, it doesn't work. The domino misses the next one. And anyway, so the last domino I want to mention is the place of works. And we should admit that there are some texts in Paul's letters that make us scratch our heads. Paul says in Romans 3:20, by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. We've said that one already. Romans 2:13, the doers of the law will be justified. Say what? So it's one of those moments, and this is the key to your biblical theology, friends, not whether you've got texts, but whether you've got text you explain away. Whether you've got text you would have put differently. I wouldn't have quite put it that way, Paul. So you've got to work out where do works fit. So we shouldn't pretend it's easy, it's not. But we've got to go to those texts and embrace them and welcome them and make sure we adjust our theology in the light of them rather than adjusting them in the light of our theology. That's the challenge. So, what do we do with this idea that works seem to play some kind of part? Tom Wright himself, and this is one of the challenges of reading Tom Wright, a bit like Luther actually, as Reese explained, says one thing in one paragraph, says another in another. So if you ask what does Tom Wright think about justification, I would just have to say, well, where, in which book? Because it does kind of move around a bit. In Tom Wright's hands, justification is a judicial verdict. It's about being accepted as part of the people of God in the present. The judgment, the final judgment verdict is brought forward to the present. and you're declared righteous now. I think that's right. But then he'll go on and say that we're justified at the final judgment on the basis of a life lived. And I think that's where it gets a bit murky. And I'll come back to this at the end as well. We've got to be careful never to compromise the clarity of the grace of God as the basis of our acceptance with God. Now, just to go techie on you, one of the ways to understand this is the prepositions. So Paul says we're saved through faith or by faith, using the Greek prepositions. So the instrument by which people are justified, it's not like faith and love, as Reese was saying, we're justified by faith and love. Faith's hard work and so is love. No, faith is the reception of a gift. But when Paul says we're justified by works or says something like that, he uses a different preposition. He uses one which we usually translate in accordance with. And what I think he means is that the obedience of believers will be in accord with God's declaration of their righteousness at the final judgment. So and I agree with my understanding of the Reformers when they say that works are the fruit or evidence that we've been justified. They're wrought by the Spirit. Now that's where this takes us back to the Roman Catholic debate with the Luther and the Reformers. So the Reformers said that we're declared righteous. That's what justification means. The Roman Catholic response, this is probably too simplistic, and Reese can correct me later. The Roman Catholic response was to say that we're made righteous. To be justified is to be made righteous. So from my perspective, that's a confusing of the doctrines of justification and sanctification. Whereas justification is a judicial category, it's a declaration from the judge that someone is vindicated innocent. And one of the key texts in the Reformation was in Romans 4, where Paul says, God justifies the ungodly. So the ungodly are declared righteous. He doesn't justify the well-behaved. So that's a few thoughts on the place of works, and that gives you some hint as to how I understand Tom Wright. So how should we read Tom Wright? Tom Wright's probably the main New Perspective person that most of us would be aware of. And I like what I read recently from Tom Schreiner, who's a kind of, in baseball analogies, he's a designated hitter. So they bring him out when things are going really badly and he whacks it out of the park. So they brought him out to, in the Gospel Coalition, to respond to Tom Wright's massive book, partly because he's such a good scholar he would have read it when he writes the review, which isn't always the case, not speaking personally. And this is, I'll read you a couple of things that he says. He says that discussions about Tom Wright easily become a matter of whether one is for him or against him. But such an approach isn't helpful and blunts the kind of discussion that is needed. It's fitting to be grateful for his contributions to scholarship, for his service to the church. He's clearly not an enemy of evangelicalism, but a friend. At the same time, we serve scholarship and truth, raising questions and concerns as well. So Schreiner, who's appreciative but critical, would be the way to say it, says, Wright has helped us to see in a new way the coherence, historical rootedness and practical ramifications of Paul's theology. So what are the practical implications? Well, one of them would be, and I keep saying this, we'll come back to it, if justification has a horizontal dimension, and the systematicians need to help us work out how that fits with the other bit, then that says something about the church. The church is Jews and Gentiles united on an equal basis in one body. So that says a lot about what sort of churches we should be fostering and aspiring to be. ones that welcome all people who trust in Christ on an equal basis. We don't give the best seats to the rich people. We include all ethnicities, etc. Yep. So that's a really practical thing. So there are some benefits of thinking through the new perspective. Now, having said that, there are certain, as I've already pointed out, my main beef is that it's reductionistic. It denies things that don't need to be denied to affirm some of its insights. My other comment is that some of its insights were there among the reformers and others already. So it kind of caricatures the magisterial reformers and their progeny. So, under point 3 over the page, you're allowed to turn over now. There's a quiz at the end. No, there isn't. The baby and the bathwater. So, do we need to throw the whole thing out? I don't think we do. And with Tom Wright, let me mention some of the books that I have no problem commending and recommending. I mean, he has a book on ethics. He has a book on the resurrection, which is just a massive thing, probably the best book ever written on the resurrection. He's got most of his stuff on the historical Jesus is really helpful. Yep. So on Paul and justification, there are some good there's some good things in there. It's quite confusing at points, and as I've said, I think he is too polemical in the way he frames things. He sort of says, "You've heard that it is said, but I say unto you." Now that's a great way to get people's attention, and in certain persons' cases, it's a good thing to say. But it's not a great thing if you're a Christian scholar or theologian. We need to be aware of the traditions we're a part of, not read through them, but read with them, and to make sure that we take seriously their contributions and not caricature them. And that's my concern with some of his work. So what areas might be seen as beneficial of the new perspective, at least in refocusing our attention, if you like? Yep. So the one book I haven't read yet that I think, his book on the cross, I think is an example of this kind of exaggerated pendulum thing, where he unfortunately denies some things, or seems to, that are fundamental. So one would be a more balanced view of Judaism. I think when Sanders wrote his book, he was right. Not all Jews were legalistic. And that shouldn't surprise us. To get Jews becoming Christians in the New Testament, Pharisees in Acts. And the people of God existed. They need to be renewed and so on, but they did exist, so it shouldn't surprise us. So the variegated nomism, if you want to read about that, there's a book. And then the problem of Jewish ethnocentrism and the question of Gentile inclusion is another big thing in Paul's hands. And the Jew-Gentile question right through the New Testament is a major theme. You just can't, well, you can miss it. You sure ought not to miss it. So one hope I have after my lecture today is you'll go back and read Paul and start to just be more aware of some of these issues that come up. So one example there, Ephesians 3, verse 6. If we go to Ephesians. Ephesians 3, verse 6, Paul talks about the mystery that was revealed to him. Now, the mystery it's not in the Old Testament. There's something in this mystery that was unexpected. In the Old Testament, obviously, blessing to the Gentiles was predicted right from Abraham on. But there was something that was a bit of a twist, this mystery that Paul talks about. Have a look, verse 6. Here it is. The Gentiles are co-heirs, co-members of the same body, and co-partners in the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. Co-heirs with whom? With the Jews. So this really was at the heart of Paul's work. He was the apostle to the Gentiles and bringing Gentiles into the renewed people of God. An extraordinary thing. So that's an example, and I'll show you a couple of others in a moment. Now, to show you that the new perspective was seen by previous scholars, one of my favourite New Testament scholars is Adolf Schlatter. It's disappointing about his Christian name. But Schlatter was a contemporary of Bultmann and worked in Tübingen. He's called the father of biblical theology in some people's opinions. And he was all over the Jewish material and understood the Old Testament amazingly and read it into the New in ways that were really helpful. Listen to what he says in one of his theology books. Done away with through Christ is the restriction of the community to Israel, and thus all those ordinances of the law that established Israel's peculiar separated existence. That's a new perspective. But he goes on to say, when giving his final answer to the question of the law, Paul did not address ritual issues such as the value of Sabbath or washings. Rather, he dealt with the commandment prescribing covetousness in Romans 7. So Schlatter saw the importance of the horizontal bit, but he also saw and affirmed very clearly the fact that we're saved by grace and not by doing. Yep. More broadly. That brings us to the horizontal dimension of justification. And whether you see justification as primarily vertical, I do. I think that's the main focus. But what I want to show you is very quickly, Paul shows its horizontal implications. So in Romans 3, we love verses 21 to 26. Many commentators say this is the most important paragraph ever written. Yep. I mark essays occasionally of students. That's not usually my comment. So the most important paragraph ever written, yeah. But then 27 to 31, as we saw a few minutes ago, is all about how God's the God of the Jews and the Gentiles. So Paul very quickly moves to see these implications for the church. And evangelicals are a little weak on the church sometimes. We're so keen on individual salvation, the church is kind of an optional extra. It wasn't for Paul. Ephesians 2, same thing. Favourite verses, Ephesians 2, 1 to 10. Second half of the chapter is all about the dividing wall of hostility coming down and the two becoming one man in Christ, one human being. The new human being has both Jews and Gentiles together. So you could define justification as I've talked about, a declaration of our righteousness, being declared righteous before God, and I think imputation, if you want to give the full picture, is part of that. But you could also say that, and this would be a broader definition, that justification by grace is about a new status before God as part of a new people of God. So then you keep the corporate, which is very clear in the New Testament, but you don't reduce it to the second half, is what I would say. Then the other one is salvation history as the backdrop to justification. So Paul didn't kind of grab justification out of the air. It's not part of the mystery. It's got an Old Testament foundation. Have a look. We haven't been to Galatians. Let's go to Galatians chapter 3. Verse 13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Because it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. Okay, we're all familiar with that verse, I'm sure, and a very profound and pointed description of how justification works by substitution, substitutionary atonement, penal substitutionary atonement. But look at the next verse. The purpose was that the blessing of Abraham would come to the Gentiles by Christ Jesus so that we could receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So the next verse talks about the promise of Abraham. And Paul does the same thing in Romans. Romans 3 is all about justification. Romans 4 is all about the promise to Abraham. 3 texts, give you some homework. 3 texts lay at the foundation of Paul's exposition of justification. And you'll know 2 of them. I reckon the third one you won't know. Can you guess the first 2? What are the Old Testament texts that Paul cites when he wants to talk about justification? Yes, Habakkuk 2:4. The just, the righteous will live by faith. Romans 1:17, and Galatians as well. Another one in Romans 4. Genesis 15:6, which says, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned or imputed to him as righteousness. What's the third one? Exactly. Leviticus 18:5. I've forgotten it myself. Leviticus 18:5 says, the one who does these things will live by them. It's in the law. And Moses says that the path to life is by doing the law. And then in Galatians 3 and Romans 10, Paul quotes that text and says, guess what? It doesn't work. Because there's a contrast between doing the law and faith. That's the contrast he sets up. Now, the other odd thing about and I'm almost out of time, about the New Perspective, you might find odd, is that it mainly works with Galatians, Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, if you're lucky. Yep. That's for a couple of reasons. One is the justification language is concentrated there. But the other reason is a lot of critical scholars don't think Paul wrote the later Paulines. And Ephesians and 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus in particular have a lot to say about works and being saved by grace. It's so clear there. If you've got works of law, if you think works of law is ambiguous, you just need to turn to Ephesians 2. It doesn't say works of law, it says works. So we're saved by grace through faith, not of works. It's right there. So it's frustrating in some sense. And as a scholar in these settings, sometimes you're given the chessboard, and on the chessboard is just Romans and Galatians and 1 and 2 Corinthians, and if you're lucky, 1 Thessalonians. And you've got these other pieces you want to bring in, and you're told you can't. But that's, in my book on Paul and the Law, I bring in all of Paul's letters. But that's just a quick complaint. But it does show you that later on, the essence of grace is maintained without any ambiguity in texts in the pastorals and in Ephesians. Then finally, I want to finish off on the grace of God. Good place to end. So, where does Paul get this idea that the law was a failed path to righteousness and life? Where does he get the idea? Pardon? That was rhetorical, but it's okay. Yes, so the experience of Israel is where I want to go. So to varying degrees, Jeremiah, Ezekiel and Daniel each lament that the Mosaic covenant and law have failed due to human sinfulness, and they declare that the time will come when people must look to God's mercy and grace alone apart from the law. And you get this, and I'll show you them briefly now. There are passages in the prophets that point where the prophets throw up their hands, or God does, and says, look, they've just broken the law completely. We're going to have a different way of coming to grace and to acceptance. So Jeremiah, for example, says that the law will be put in their minds and written on their hearts, Jeremiah 31. A new covenant will supersede the old. The reason is because they broke my covenant. That's what he says. So when you get to Paul, it's not surprising. He agrees with that. Ezekiel's vision of the new covenant expectation makes the same point. The Lord will act to restore his people to the land for the sake of his holy name, cleansing them from their idols and impurities, and promises to give them a new heart and a new spirit. Verse 27 says, in Ezekiel 36, that not keeping the law of Moses is the problem, and God's spirit of enablement will be part of the solution. And then in Daniel 9, it says, we do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. Now, Westerholm, in his earlier book, Israel's Law and the Church's Faith, he points to these and says they're a kind of postscript to his discussion. To my mind, the Old Testament background is not illustrative or tangential, but critical and formative. The Old Testament prophets predict that a failure to do the law will result in an unprecedented intervention of God's mercy and grace. And Paul declares that this has come to fulfilment in Christ, which I think goes a long way to understanding his insistence that believers in Christ are not under the law and are not justified by works of the law.